Hello and welcome. Good evening. My name is Nathan Limbo, and I'm the program manager of the ICP program, as well as a graduate of the program. And we are recording this event tonight. It's going to be available on our new YouTube page, and I will let you all know how to get there soon. I started thinking about this panel a little over a year ago at an ICP admissions event that the admissions office puts on about once a year, twice a year, for all of the programs to answer questions from prospective applicants. And it's usually a busy event. There's lots going on. We get fielding questions from everywhere. And at one point during the night, someone came up to me and just said, so what is transpersonal psychology? And my mind just went blank. Like I didn't know how to answer. And I think I ended up saying something like, you know, it's an incorporation of Western psychology with an honor of the divine in the human being. And as the night went on, about 6 more people asked me that question, and I answered it in 6 or 7 different ways. And I was telling a friend about that experience later that night or the next day, and in the conversation I remembered a book that someone had given me about 15 years ago. You might be familiar with it as a collection of essays on spiritual practice and transpersonal psychology called Paths Beyond Ego. And I remembered that book and the title of it, and I thought, oh, that's all I had to say. Transpersonal psychology is a path beyond ego. And I also thought, and there's Freud, as ego is a Freudian term. So I mentioned this panel, this idea for the panel, to Barbara Morrill this past spring, and we both thought it was a great idea, but didn't have the resources to put it on. So we've been sitting on it for a little while, and now we have a chance. As it turns out, Barbara and Bob Walters have been talking together and had come up with a similar idea for a panel, so it has evolved into contemporary psychoanalysis, an unwitting instrument of spiritual sensibilities. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Okay, and we're going to find out what that means. It's great to have you all here tonight. This is really exciting, and it's exciting for us to kick off the new year with a program around psychoanalysis and spirituality for the ICP program. And I feel much pleasure tonight because all of these panelists are actually my friends. I figured out this is a great way to get my friends together. And they're all here. And I'd just like to say a few things about each person. You've read about them, but it's very special to have them here. And I'll start with Bob because we've been having conversations for a long time about the connection between psychology and spirituality. We're both graduates of ITP, and Bob has been a professor at ITP as well as a clinical supervisor, and he's been really focused on this topic. We've talked a lot about theology and psychology and the diamond work and so many things that we share. And one of them, when I told him I had this job, up came the idea for this panel. So, longtime friend, longer time, even longer, further back, is Shubha Herlekar, who I've known for a very long time, and we have interests in South Asian mental health. She is someone who's also been on panels when we've done panels on cultural complexes, and we've worked in this area of looking at different cultures and the experiences and the trauma that has gone on in other cultures when we look at both psychological and spiritual experience. And we also have some connection around a project that she did called the Kali Project. So we've had a long time association. She is I guess it's called a post-seminar candidate for PINK, which is the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. And she is also an MFT and has been in private practice for many years. Next, long-term friendship is Helen Marlo, right there, and she is just about to complete her work at the Jung Institute. She also is a program director and a professor at Notre Dame and leads their clinical master's program. And she has had a private practice for a long time and has really done a lot of work in reproductive mental health, in prepartum, postpartum issues for women, birth, and I would just add that I am the godmother of her 7.5-year-old daughter. So that's a very special thing for me. And last here on the table, and probably newest friend to me, is Fernando Castrillon, who I met here, and he is a professor in the community mental health department. And we had him teach. He's a Lacanian, also a candidate in the Lacanian school in Berkeley, and we had him teach at our retreat. We have an intensive retreat at ICP during the summers at IONS, and from what I hear from those of you who are there, he's a hit. He's always a hit. So we're really happy to have him, and he's a special friend here at this school. So we are going to start this evening with Bob Walters. Thank you.
Thank you. As Barbara has just said, she and I have been having conversation about and around the things that we're going to consider here tonight for a number of years. And about a year ago, we had a conversation that seemed to put a slightly sharper point on things, if it's possible to put a slightly sharper point on the things we're going to consider tonight. And then a few months ago, we got together and Barbara said, "What was it we talked about a year ago?" She said, "That was good." And I said, "Yeah, I think that was good. What was it?" So we talked about it some more to see if we could resurrect what we had talked about and put a slightly sharper point on. And then I said to her, "You know, I think it would be interesting if we could invite some other people to join us." And so she did, and here we are. Now, I understand some of you are here under duress. Those of you who have left, you know why you're here under duress. We know who you are now. You have identified yourself, because in order to be part of Barbara's class, you had to come. And that was very good. Not clever of you, but very good. So my job, if I understand it for the evening, is to give some context to what we're going to talk about together, and then say a few things about Wilfred Bion. I thought that the most useful way to give some context to what we're going to talk about is start by talking about the title of the presentation: Contemporary Psychoanalysis, an Unwitting Instrument of Spirituality. Now, one of the, I'm under a number of disadvantages. One of them is I'm not sure what your background is, so some of the things that I say, I hope they won't offend or seem condescending, because some of them may seem quite self-evident to you. But I'll address these things in this fashion anyway. So let me start with the word contemporary. As many of you know, maybe most people know, Freud, I think, is the undisputed father of psychoanalysis. Not too many people would argue with that. But in Freud's absence, his students and devotees have been making mischief with the master's work. They have, though Freud, I think, got a lot of things right, I think Freud probably got a lot of things wrong as well. And so, in the years since Freud wrote his canon of work, presented it to us, that was quite brilliant but limited, people who have been following the psychoanalytic tradition and have been following Father Freud have felt free to make some corrections to his work. Those corrections comprise what we now call contemporary psychoanalysis, and there are a lot of things to say about the differences between classical psychoanalysis and contemporary psychoanalysis. They still have a shared father, but the approach theoretically and practically in terms of what psychoanalysis actually looks like is significantly different. I'll try to summarize just some of that difference. it seems to me that the best place to start in summarizing the difference between contemporary psychoanalysis and classical psychoanalysis is with the language that's now used. We talk about two-person psychology versus one-person psychology. Is that familiar language to you? So one-person psychology, which is sort of the bedrock of classical psychoanalysis, somebody goes in, essentially talks to somebody in a white lab coat who is a blank screen, and transfers onto that person all of the things that, all of their psychopathology, and somehow through that process gets healed in some way. In contrast to that, in contemporary psychoanalysis, the belief and the conviction and the commitment is that there are two real people in the room. Not simply a blank screen and a quote-unquote patient, but two real people in the room. Establishing a real relationship, a relationship that, though profoundly affected by transference and countertransference, cannot be adequately and exhaustively explained by the notions of transference and countertransference. There is, in addition to transference and countertransference, a real relationship that's being established between two human beings. And this, it seems to me, is the fundamental distinction between classical psychoanalysis and contemporary psychoanalysis. Two flawed, frightened human beings in the room together. So Wilfred Bion, who I will talk about in a little while, one of the statements that he makes that has always pleased, delighted, sometimes comforted me, and sometimes caused my knees to shake a bit. The statement is this, from Bion: there ought to be two very frightened and confused people in the consulting room, or one wonders why they're even bothering to be there together. Two very frightened, confused people. Not an all-knowing analyst and a frightened, confused patient. Two people who, according to Peter Fonagy, are co-constructing a real emotional experience together and only retrospectively putting language on that experience, all of which is a radar on the inarticulate with very shabby equipment. And attempting to find ways to, so listen, this is Fonagy's statement, so follow it closely if you can. Attempting to find ways to think their feelings and feel their thoughts. It's my experience, conviction, that human experience is at its most saturated, at its richest, when thinking, feeling, and communication are coincident with one another. They're all happening at the same time. They're not dissociated. We're not talking about a feeling in some cerebrally abstracted way. We're actually finding and discovering our words while we're feeling what we're feeling and turning that into a shared interpersonal experience. So these things, it seems to me, there are many more ways to talk about what distinguishes contemporary psychoanalysis from classical psychoanalysis. But if you'll just hold in your mind this notion that there really are two real people in the room who have a reciprocal, though asymmetrical relationship. Reciprocal, there's a real back and forth, but there is a natural and appropriate asymmetry to it. If there was not an asymmetry to it, then one person should not be paying the other person. We have different roles, a real relationship nonetheless. So the next word in the title that I want to focus on is the word unwitting. Unwitting. Psychoanalysis in its origins, and probably even up to today, has wanted to found itself on the bedrock of quote-unquote hard empirical science, whatever that might mean. Hard empirical science. That started with Freud, that legacy has been passed down. The psychoanalytic community has largely wanted to avoid the murkiness and soft-mindedness of quote-unquote religion or spirituality or fluffy metaphysics. They wanted to found themselves on this bedrock of empirical science, not wanting to see themselves as a hermeneutical discipline but as an empirical scientific discipline. That has been the tradition of psychoanalysis, and even up to the present day, many contemporary psychoanalysts are still very nervous. They're in the closet. They don't want to talk about anything that we would think of as meta, beyond the domain of material human experience. There's still reluctance. But to my delight, notwithstanding that reluctance, there are a number of psychoanalysts who have sort of come to the end of the rope of dealing with empirical reality as a way to help people construct meaning in their lives, and have come to realize that there must be something larger. And in that sense, have started unwittingly to help people to develop larger, what I'm going to talk about in a minute, uppercase meaning in their lives that begins to move in the direction of a spiritual sensibility. By spiritual, obviously there are lots of different ways to define that. I'm just simply suggesting that for our purpose of what spiritual means is that there is a ground of existence. It precedes us. It transcends us. We participate in it and with it. And eventually, whether we're conscious of it or not, we're headed back toward it. That's a spiritual, that's what I mean by a spiritual reality. It is something that is larger than we are. It contains us. We participate with it. Gabriel Marcel said that I've come to the conviction that I need to submit myself to something that is more truly myself than I am myself. And I think that what Marcel was a Catholic theologian, I think what he was referring to was this ineffable spiritual reality. I would like to suggest to you, I can't prove this, I'll offer it as an assertion, that this particular reality we call spiritual reality is more ontologically dense and rich and saturated than the typical material reality that occupies most of our lives. And it's from that domain that we have the possibility of creating what I'm going to refer to as uppercase meaning. There's the title. I operate from the premise, and it's stated here in the description of the presentation, that any good, thorough psychotherapy, regardless of theoretical orientation, should hope to address three things. To help people to help relieve unnecessary suffering. I included the word unnecessary there because it seems to be, for reasons that I don't necessarily understand, but it seems that there is a kind of necessary quotient of suffering in human growth and development. But there also is such a thing as unnecessary suffering. And it seems to me that one of the first obligations of any hard-working psychotherapy is to help people to attenuate that in some fashion. Next, to help people to remobilize functioning. To help people remobilize functioning. Not just attenuate suffering, but help them become more functional. If they're not sleeping at night, to help them sleep. If they're doing things that compromise their capacity to work, to help them with those things. If they're in relationships that are completely dysfunctional, associated with their own kind of developmental arrest, that a hard-working therapy will assist people with those kinds of things. And then finally, the last thing, in my opinion, a hard-working and somewhat thorough psychotherapy should hope to address, regardless of theoretical orientation, is to help people create or discover meaning. To create or discover meaning. This last one, create or discover meaning, is not, whether you know it or not, in the therapeutic community, this is not a popular idea, at least as we look at the practice of what therapists often usually do. This is not a popular idea. It's certainly not popular with insurance companies. So, if you're a therapist and you're in communication with the insurance company, and the insurance company says, so what are your goals with this patient? And you say, well, one of my goals is to help them create or discover meaning. And I need 2 more sessions. I need actually 5 more years. And the person on the other end says, not only will we not give you 2 more sessions, we're going to require you to give the money back that we paid you for the last 12. there is a certain animus in the broader medical community that unfortunately too often is shared by the therapeutic community about this idea of uppercase meaning. So let me try to give you some example of what I mean by uppercase meaning. For some years I worked with a man, in most ways quite functional, and partway into the therapy, on Thursday evenings, he would go home and verbally abuse his wife and sometimes physically abuse his wife. Not long after that started, his wife started eating a pound of C's candy every Thursday afternoon. About the same time, their 13-year-old daughter started wetting the bed. All those events are meaningful events. It's important to understand them as an effort to helping them attenuate and change that behavior. They are meaningful events. And as meaningful and as important as those events are, they are different. Asking, for example, what's the meaning of the fact that this man started coming home on Thursday evenings and started abusing his wife? What's the meaning of the fact that this woman, his wife, started eating a box of C's candy on Thursday afternoon? What's the meaning of the fact that their 13-year-old daughter started wetting the bed? Those are important questions. Those questions are different than this question. What is the meaning of this man's life? What's the meaning of this woman's life? What's the meaning of this little girl's life? And in there, I'm making a distinction between lowercase meaning and uppercase meaning. Not to devalue lowercase meaning. It's critically important. But quite often in our infatuation with understanding lowercase meaning, we lose contact with something other, some larger experience of meaning that impoverishes our capacity to make meaning even at the lower levels. So that's to just give you a bird's eye view of what I mean when I talk about uppercase meaning. You can see as I talk about this how, and by the way, as I talk about Bion, I'll suggest that there are others within the psychoanalytic community who are influenced by this sensibility. But you can see as I talk about this, and as I use this language, that it begins to swim in the direction of what we typically think of as spirituality. And there's a point at which the language breaks down and the hard and fast distinctions that we make between clinical psychoanalysis and spirituality become so diaphanous that they become meaningless. They no longer apply. And there, in my experience, there's a point in working with people, a point in the encounter, when some of the hard and fast and clear definitions that we make about, well, are we doing therapy here? Are we doing psychotherapy? Are we doing cognitive behavioral therapy? Are we doing psychoanalysis? Or are we doing some kind of spiritual work? At some point, those distinctions may break down. I continue to think it's important for us to be rigorous and understanding that there are definite symptoms and pathologies that we have to address, and it would be profoundly misguided and irresponsible to come into a room with somebody who had those symptoms and say to them, you know, your ontological being is a little weak and we need to talk about spirituality here. That's very problematic. In fact, in my own experience, the best ways to bring this kind of spiritual sensibility into the therapeutic context is that it gets smuggled in. And quite often, the person you're working with doesn't even know it's happening until it's happening. So I'd like to say just a few things about Wilfred Bion. Is he a familiar name to you? Some of you are familiar with Wilfred Bion. I first read Bion 22 years ago. And I was struck by two things at once. I didn't understand a word he was saying, and I knew he was on to something really, really profound. Bion, it's easy to get flummoxed when reading Bion. He invents his own language, he tortures language, he moves in and out of metaphysical language and scientifically grounded language, and he's a moving target. When reading Bion, it's hard to know whether you're reading a psychoanalyst or you're reading a mystic. over the last many years, it's occurred to me that Bion was fundamentally a mystic who had as his day job working as a psychoanalyst. His sensibilities were quite mystical in orientation. The reason that I started reading Bion 22 years ago was that most of the other people I was reading all spoke with great admiration of Bion. They all referred to him and even deferred to him. Thomas Ogden, Michael Eigen, James Grotstein, Adam Phillips, just Stephen Mitchell, all of them, you could almost, on the occasions that I had opportunity to have personal conversation with these men, you could see a kind of glow as they would talk about Bion. I find him to be quite amazing. So, just a few more words about Bion, and then I'll pass the baton. Perhaps the most fundamental way, and there's so many things, of course, to say about Bion. Perhaps the most fundamental thing to say about Bion was that his hope in working with people was to help people develop greater negative capacity. By negative capacity, he didn't mean becoming negative. He meant something like this. Of all of the various definitions of psychological health that we can think of, the one that seems to be most useful from Bion's point of view, and now from my own, is this. The capacity to tolerate not knowing and not be overwhelmed by anxiety in the face of our not knowing. It's a simply stated little definition that has huge implications. If it's the case that our truest and most natural state of being is not knowing, and it is the case, by the way, because none of us here know if and when we're going to get our next breath. We don't know that. We don't know that we'll survive the evening. We presume we do, which usually comes out of a defensively contracted place, because we don't want to open ourselves to the uncertainty of not knowing. So if not knowing is that ubiquitous and that central to our experience, and if for most of us the experience of not knowing creates substantial anxiety, then perhaps the most ubiquitous part of the human experience creates incredible anxiety. That needs to be responded to if we're going to move in the direction of a freer, more liberated life. Bion was on to that. The attenuation of anxiety, anxiety being the mother, and you can intone that word any way you want to intone it, the mother of all disturbing affect. Everything else that disturbs us is a derivative of that. Bion suggested that the way that we begin to attenuate that anxiety about not knowing is to develop our capacity for what he called F in O. Bion had a grid. Do you know, anybody know? He had a grid. And he translated all these things into letters. F in O. O for Bion was the letter that symbolized that which cannot be named. We can come this close to it. It's the ground of being. Some of Bion's interpreters, like Michael Eigen, referred to it as a brilliant beam of darkness. Is that incredible? A brilliant beam of darkness. Talk about a beautiful oxymoron. A brilliant beam of darkness. That's O. We can't know O, we can only approach O. We approach O, that is the ground of our being, through what Bion called F. F refers to the word faith. Faith. From a psychoanalyst. They're not supposed to use words like faith. We approach O through F. All of human experience, according to Bion, exists in the dialectical tension and dialectical crosshairs between what he called catastrophe and faith. He defined catastrophe this way. Everything, literally everything, including ourselves, is falling apart at light speed. Everything, no exceptions, falling apart at light speed. That's catastrophe. Faith, everything coheres and is as it should be. that human existence unfolds if we have the eyes to see it and the courage to express it, to allow ourselves to feel it. Everything in human existence, if we're honest enough, and we're able to engage in what Bion calls telling the emotional truth of the moment, exists in the crosshairs between catastrophe and faith. When we move too hard on the side of catastrophe, we've collapsed the dialectic, and we've become bereft of faith. When we're too hard on the side of faith, it's probably false faith that's not being purified by the other side of the dialectic, which is catastrophe. Everything is falling apart, everything coheres in the same moment. For Bion, that required that we let go of our traditional ways of knowing, which are, for him, defensively contracted strategies to keep us from feeling the harrowing version of what is. We think we know. We don't really know. And liberation, does this sound like a spiritual sensibility? Liberation comes from letting go of that. Not becoming sloppy, not becoming not rigorous, but letting go of the neurotic pursuit of knowing. I'll close with this. James Grotstein, some of you may know of him. Maybe you've spoken with him. A very bright, very charming, winsome psychoanalyst. A guy who knows almost everything, it seems. Nobody knows everything, but he knows a lot. Grotstein was in analysis with Bion. And Grotstein's big on knowing. Grotstein was in analysis with Bion, and Bion made an interpretation. And Grotstein said, "Oh, I understand." And Bion said, please, Mr. Grotstein, please try not to understand. His point was, your defensively constructed strategies to understand and know are the source of your psychopathology and are only keeping your anxiety slightly at bay. Okay, so there's much more to say, but I'll stop there and pass things along.
Well, thank you. That really set the frame, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to present a Lacanian perspective on this kind of theme. And it's interesting because Lacan did appreciate Bion highly, so much so that he actually went and visited Bion during World War II, and was highly impressed by what the work he was doing, and then incorporated a lot of it. I hear shades of that as you were speaking, especially this whole focus on not knowing, which is a big part of the orientation of the lineage that I come out of. So as a Lacanian, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in the room who's like, Lacanian? What is that? So this might be an interesting way of kind of like putting that out there. So as a Lacanian, stay close to Freud's methodology, in that I consider psychotherapy to be both an invention and a discovery of meaning all at the same time. But it's a certain kind of meaning. It's singular, it's individual, and it's not meaning in some grand sense. So while I wholeheartedly sit with what was laid out before in terms of meaning in this grand sense, right? The kind of meaning I'm speaking about here is more meaning in lowercase, which then allows a connection to meaning with a big M later. So, and most importantly, this invention or discovery of meaning is not enjoyable or fun. So that's the big theme of my talk, right? Not fun, not enjoyable, not fuzzy, not warm. It's an arduous task, that can only be done through a certain kind of speaking. And I'm very clear about that. Not a certain kind of thinking, not a certain kind of feeling, but a very certain kind of speaking of one's desire. It cannot be done in a short amount of time. It's an unfolding that has its own tempo, its own rhythm, that of the unconscious. So while we may like the idea of psychoanalysis or the unconscious in the abstract, and we may enjoy studying it, the act of psychoanalysis is arduous, difficult, unsavory, and the last thing in the world most of us would want to do, either as analysts or analysts. Lacan refers to it as the horror of the act. So the horror of the act. But it's damn interesting, and that's the whole point. The same goes for the unconscious, this other seeing, this ungraspable thing that is only approached obliquely, is unstabilizing, dethroning, and repudiates, and upsets most of what we hold dear regarding ourselves. We are not the masters of our own house, and that is the last thing we want to sit with and surrender to. And it is in this way that as a Lacanian, I understand psychoanalysis to be an unwitting instrument of spirituality. Spiritual practice is not necessarily, here you go again, it's kind of like a theme here, obviously, not necessarily fuzzy, warm, and nice. Like psychoanalysis, it is a profoundly disturbing experience. It upsets what we hold dear. And we are left not with answers, but with questions more expansive and less directly answerable than those we might have held before. But, okay, here's the question, though, because I'm kind of like on this roll about, okay, it's not nice, and it's not fuzzy, and it's not warm. But what is it that's being upset and disturbed that finds this work, both psychoanalytic and spiritual, so frankly repulsive? And I'm using these words very sort of like, thought a lot about them before I put them down on paper. And telling you guys, what the hell was I thinking, saying this kind of thing? As a Lacanian, I would say that it's the ego that's being disturbed here. It's being undermined. That sense of ourselves that is derivative of that image in the mirror we regard to be ourselves. My message is not long, so please stay with me, even though it might not be fun, or warm, or fuzzy, or nice. So the ego, that flattened, nullifying sense of selfhood that we hold so dear, is precisely what spiritual practices and psychoanalysis urge us to go beyond. It's the ego. It's that simple. That simple. But it is that simple. And while the psychoanalytic and spiritual urging might sound nice and even romantic from the outside, it certainly is not within the experience itself. Lacanians call this experience castration. I know it sounds horrible. It is the pound of flesh extracted by the socius, by social life itself, in order to be human. In other words, that's what allows us to be human. And it is so horrific that we repress it. And here is the birth of the unconscious, at least for Lacanians, that's where it happens. Hence, it's no accident that in contemporary Western cultures, psychoanalysis and spirituality are so often paired up. That's the thing that really amazed me when I got to the West Coast, was how many psychoanalytic types of one stripe or another, and it didn't matter the stripe. They were heavily into spirituality, particularly Zen. I was like, what's this about? And after years and years of thinking about it, it really starts making sense.
Yeah.
There is something quite ineffable, right? That both or all of them are trying to get to, but none of them can really put words to, right? They are akin in that both are almost unacceptable practices, and very few folks really want to do it, and I mean that, right? Myself included.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm some holy light being of purity that somehow is all gung-ho about this. I really come to this with massive amounts of trepidation. So I'm sincere about this. Who in their right mind would want to do any of this? Really? Right? Other than the folks who are here because a certain professor told them they had to be here. All right? Who the hell told us to come and try and do this stuff? In my experience, in either spirituality or psychoanalysis, Many people enter wanting to master the experience or the methodology. Master it. They want to speak about themselves, but not themselves speak. I'll say that one more time, because it took me years to even formulate that for myself. They want to speak about themselves, kind of removed in the abstract. Fernando this and Fernando that. And I did this and I did that. Right? But not themselves speak. Because what does it mean to actually speak? The speaking that I'm talking about, that does something very special. Because it is a certain kind of speaking. And it does do something very special. So, despite this rather bizarre and absurd question of why the hell are we even trying to do something like this, I do feel that something does propel us forward. Because behind our passion for ignorance, behind our attachment to the very dynamics that keep us miserable, there is something else. A subjectivity that has been squelched, that has been tied up in knots, that is waiting to speak to another. But that's the important part. Speak to another. Because, another. Because when you try and do that, it sets up the conditions for something else to happen. But you have to take the step forward. And it's not easy. Again, it's really not. I'm just speaking from my experience. And that promise is what keeps me in this field. Listening, waiting, for that little bird that starts singing, the peculiar song that only it can sing, because it is inventing it as it goes along. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us all, and thanks for staying with us on an evening like this. So, it's a treat and difficulty to follow the two of you, but I'm going to try. So here I go. When Nathan and Barbara contacted us to let us know about the panel, I just tried to sit with the three questions that Bob introduced, and just try to come up with how I would answer them right now. The idea of suffering, how would I consider remobilizing functioning, and the importance of creating meaning. So I'd just like to share my thoughts. In my opinion, suffering is when we feel pain without others' company. To be alone in our feelings, our states of mind, and not connected to one another. At such times, we can feel that our love is too much, that it can destroy, or that our hate is malignant instead of necessary and real. Often, we can feel traumatized when people around us have denied our right to our perceptions and our realities. And finally, we suffer when we feel we have lost perspective, when we feel out of contact with time. Our pain can feel unrelenting. When we feel disengaged from our groups and institutions, we lose crucial mirrors to help us know who we are. And when we lose sight of our place in history, we can feel bereft and doubtful of the sanctity of our own lives. So, this idea of remobilizing functioning. In my opinion, relational psychoanalysis holds the premise that the relationship with your analyst will be the main agent of change, and that within that relationship, old ways can transform. Restoring a sense of safety and identity for a patient comes fundamentally from the here and now engagements with their analyst, where the unexpected and familiar have equal reign. We hope to bring back to life processes that were painfully derailed. For example, a patient's sense of aliveness and embodied being is deeply connected to the emotional contact they had with their own parents. When these identifications were shattered or insufficient, a person's connection to themselves is stalled. Our patient's parents themselves suffered, and so, as most of you know, often their abilities to engage with their children, our patients, was very limited. So when patients can engage with their analyst in vibrant ways, such as being free to have a positive identification or to feel safe to express moments of disidentification in a secure relationship, it allows something that had been frozen to finally thaw. In my mind, hope is restored. Relational analysts often speak of a work of enactments, where something that had been dissociated in either the patient, the analyst, or both, such as a painful feeling like shame, has erupted in some kind of interaction. Often these are uncomfortable and pretty much can knock everyone onto their back. And it takes courage and faith, in my mind, and a certain kind of analytic commitment to make sense of those moments together and still know that the attachment is secure. This, I think, is the fundamental hope that analysis provides, that relationships will eventually and inevitably have ruptures, but that they can be restored, and that both people can not only survive, but thrive in those moments of contrast. Rigidity of different kinds has a chance to soften, and maybe even a person can learn to be more curious about another fundamental aspect of our being, the unconscious and what it might start to reveal in his or her unique subjectivity. So this idea of meaning. Meaning seems to be vital in our existence as real subjects acting from our own desires. In the process of analytic work, my hope is that patients would come to know more about themselves, know their own histories, and articulate their identities, so that they can feel that they have their needs met in the world. When that security is in place, then the other aspects of meaningful life have their chance to come in and to excite and enliven a person's world, rather than just frighten or overwhelm them. The two areas that seem vital are to feel a sense of purpose, of knowing how one wants to engage in the world, and to actually feel free to do so. And the other pivotal area of our lives seems to be to have a connection to the mystery of the unconscious, to live side by side with what we don't yet know about ourselves or others, and to have this feel energizing. Perhaps secure in our sense of who we are, we might feel able to explore these amazing new territories and just see where we are each taken.
Well, I found myself today thinking a lot about my father's accent and the different dialects, and I thought, I wonder what I'm thinking about that. And as I've listened to these three presentations, it's suddenly much more clear to me now. And I'm struck by how the points that have been emphasized in the three speakers before me are things that are also somewhat in my presentation, but in a slightly different dialect, all the different languages of psychoanalysis. I thought I would start by rather than speaking about Jung's model, I gave a handout, I think hopefully you all have, I thought I would read a dream, and a dream of a very powerful dream for a woman that I worked with for many years. And I thought we could just spend a little time with the dream and see what, rather than sharing with you about her, is to just see where it goes for each of you. And then when we have a little time to do that, after that I can share a little bit about the real person. And I think it brings together central aspects of meaning for Jung and from a Jungian lens. So I'll go ahead and read the dream. I'm sleeping in a bed. It does not look like my bed. The sheets are stark white, and it looks like there are some words stamped all around the bottom of the sheet in black. There are metal rails on the bed. I awaken suddenly because the sheets have been ripped away from me suddenly. I am confused. I don't know how this happened or who may have done this. I don't have any clothes on, and I'm breathing heavily. There's a medical-looking kind of gown that has been cast aside. I feel as if I am being watched, but there is no one in my room. It is only me in my bed, alone, naked, and with all the covers ripped down. I peer over the side of the bed. There's liquid of some kind on the floor. I'm afraid of what it is, and that I will slip on it if I get out of this bed. I also notice there is a small decorative egg in the eastern corner of the room, resting on a holder. There's a crack in it. It is shimmering a light shade of iridescent colors. So I thought maybe some people maybe we could take a couple minutes and just be with some of your thoughts about the dream, how you might think about it as a therapist, how you might think about it if a person came to you with this, and if anybody is willing to share that.
What immediately strikes me is just the sense of absolute loss of control.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she's literally like stripped down, naked. She
Yeah.
can't get out of the bed. Everything's been ripped away from her, and it's like she can't leave the bed because there's this water that's on the floor, and just a sense of ultimate terror.
Yes.
Real, like a psychotic level of terror.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, go. You're gonna add something else?
I was just really curious about the crack in the egg.
Yeah. Yeah. What, do you have any thought
Well,
about the crack?
Well, for me, it was thinking to the crack of the unconscious,
Uh-huh.
and like something spilled out, like the leaky water
Yes, yes.
of unconscious knowing, or primary process, let's say.
Yeah.
But I guess I still have to think about why it would be so decorated, other than it was used the jewel of the self and it's being cracked and
Uh-huh. Wonderful, yeah. Thank you.
other things I think.
Thank you. Is there a hand back there?
Yeah, it just strikes me as like an account of being born.
Was there anything in the dream in particular that brought that up?
Well, the bed and the liquid on the floor and the cracked egg and the
Yeah.
and the sheets being ripped off, the medical professional.
Yes, yes,
I think that's what I remember.
yes.
There seems to be some kind of shimmering sense of hope, and being in the east and the sun rises in the east.
Yes,
Being just some primordial kind of rebirth
yes,
coming out of this madness.
yes. That's lovely, thank you.
I'm gonna make a wild guess. We have this fragmentation, the psychosis, the hatching egg, the rebirth. That could be something like a spiritual awakening, a situation of spiritual emergency. We talk about meaning, and some kind of falling apart, and something new emerges that is not quite comprehensible.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
I was actually thinking it's like the opposite, instead of like birth, more like death. Water on the floor, I was just thinking blood,
Uh-huh.
being scared of the implications of losing something, not wanting to go there.
Yes, yes.
And the cracking of the egg was just like, oh,
Something
perhaps
dying.
this egg, for me, symbolized the eggs of the woman, perhaps starting to fade away, being lost.
Yes.
It all sounds pretty sexy to me.
That's a great segue, thank you. I like that.
I think what everybody said, including
Well,
the-
that is,
That's it, we're done.
I mean, that's the only thing that's repressed, right? Everything
Exactly.
else is acceptable. Spirituality, birth, reborn,
for
Hope,
death, yeah.
death, it's all perfectly acceptable, except what isn't spoken.
And who said psychoanalysis isn't sexy, right? Kinky. So, I am very touched. I think that is a good segue for where this is going. And in fact, I don't think any of you said had an association that didn't fit in with the real person and the real details of this individual that I worked with. And I think that's a piece of what Jung was talking about in his model. His model of the psyche was that it's inherently, the psyche is inherently meaning-making and has an inherent religious function. So he said that much to the chagrin of people in the psychoanalytic movement many years ago. I'll share with you a bit about the real person and then link it briefly to what's on your handout. So this is an individual who did come to see me. She had a long history of physical trauma from her father, and she came to, as well as a very absent relationship with her mother. She came to me because she was very concerned about becoming a mother herself and repeating the same wounds. And so she was quite frightened of having a child. Part of the terror, she had just abject terror, psychotic level, as she would say. And part of the terror was of what she had experienced herself, but there was always an unknown part. I think like Shubha talked about, like Bob talked about as well. So one of the things that she would repeatedly have was this dream, and there were some small variations over the years, but it was always the same over and over, and she couldn't get at what does this mean? Why do I keep having it? And many of the things that you talked about were some of the meanings that we could come up with over time. And I think there was a challenge, as has been mentioned, about this lowercase m meaning and the uppercase m meaning. I have a quote here that Jung talks about, the second one, where he says, that there's a lot of talk about meaning, but only because one is looking for it, and so one becomes obsessed with it, and it's not genuine meaning. That's the second quote on your handout. But so part of the meaning was, one of the things in Jung's model is to talk about regressive energy in the psyche as well as progressive energy. And by that, there was always the question of, was this in some way the way her psyche was emulating the physical abuse she suffered? She always wondered, was there something more? Was there some kind of sexual trauma that she couldn't get at that had been repressed? On the other hand, the progressive part would look at, as was noted, that sounded like an experience of birth, and that connected very much with what she was wanting in the future. So it had both that dual role. Jung talked a lot about the affect being a central organizing principle in the psyche, that you can't really know anything unless you know the affect. And so in this dream, which would come up many, many times over many years, one of the core things I would be looking at was the different affective changes over time. The notion of association and dissociation is huge in the Jungian model of the psyche, and so while Freud made the contribution of repression, Jung talked quite a lot about dissociation, and the psyche modeled in that way, and that this was also a normal function of our psyche. And so in that way, all of these different interpretations were fitting when you look at beings from a model of having multiple selves and what self state she was in, what had been dissociated in any moment. And then lastly, the notion of purpose. So what was the purpose of this dream? Why did it keep coming up? And that is a huge piece in looking at meaning from this lens. And I think what is rather dramatic about this dream, I'll share the dramatic part, was, and this is really very rare in my experience, and especially in working with a lot of individuals who've suffered a lot of different kinds of trauma. She would consistently have this dream, and it's almost pop psychology or too reductionistic to think that this was a screen memory, but indeed it was. And years into our therapy, she went home and she actually called me while she was on her vacation going home, and she was in a totally traumatized, dissociated state. She had found her childhood diary, and the childhood diary said, she was in 7th grade at the time, and it said, I went to volleyball today. I woke up again this morning without my nightgown on. I don't know how my nightgown could be off. I don't know how it's getting off, if someone's taking it off of me, or if I'm taking it off every night. And it was riveting for her, given that she would continually say, was I sexually abused? And my answer was to stay in the unknown. We didn't know, and it would have been quite damaging to have said something on that. We could talk about it from many other lenses. The even more dramatic part, when we talk about, I think this mystery, and this was something that, Jung talked quite a lot about here. What Bob had mentioned around faith. He talks about giving the patient faith, hope, love, and understanding. He also talks about the notion that the doctor has to be able to give one an experience of God to the patient. That there has to be a cultivation of that. And in a really dramatic experience in our therapy around this dream that, as again Jung says, these things can't be created, they can't be made, they emerge out of experience. She did finally have a child after many, many years. And the day she gave birth was the same day as the diary entry that she found of finding herself naked. And for her, that was a real movement of this energy, this God energy, this something larger, this beyond ego place. The egg, the cracking was, someone mentioned here about disease or something, the cracking was that she had gotten repeatedly very negative news about her capacity to have a child as well, on a physical level as well as on a psychological level. She was evidently had diseases and her eggs were not good. That was what she had been told. The eastern corner is interesting. You also picked up on that. This is someone that she said, I don't even know north, south, east, and west. I don't even know why I would have that. That means nothing to me intellectually. But what it did mean for her was about the beginning. It was also a composite for her. She thought it was interesting that it said Eastern, and she associated both to Easter and to Eastern religious traditions. And so in that, for her, there was part of holding the faith and her spiritual path, holding her in the face of a lot of suffering in her life as a child. So in the peering over the bed, there was the notion of, I think, like you brought up, about who would ever in their right mind do this work. And, for her, she said, that you're either stuck on this horrible, scary bed, or else you have to go into the waters. You have to go into the waters of the unconscious, and you may slip, that kind of thing. And so it's really, again, modeling that piece that you brought up, that she felt that it was such an arduous task. I don't want to do this, and yet I have to do it. And then lastly, I think that the part that was so crucial, that Shubha was bringing up as well, is that, early on Jung talked about that the healing element for transformation is the humanity and the mutuality of the analytic relationship. On your handout, he says, the analyst is a fellow participant who finds himself involved in the dialectical process just as deeply as the so-called patient. By no device can the treatment be anything but the product of mutual influence in which the whole being of the doctor, as well as that of his patient, plays its part. And infused in this dream were was a lot of transferential material. I worked with her, and in the course of my work with her, had 3 children. So you can imagine how that got played out in some of the transferential dimensions here.
Thank you. And we're going to summarize. Should we just go for questions?
Well, some time ago Barbara asked me to maybe summarize. And so I think I will cleverly, or perhaps not so cleverly, say that it might be more interesting if you could summarize what you've heard here.
Good one.
Are you going to say it was sexy?
I already said that. You calling for summaries?
Yes.
I can't summarize all of it, but one thing, I noticed that I think 3 out of the 4 of you emphasized and highlighted heavily the idea of a relationship, either mutual or asymmetrical. I mean, it was described in different ways, but it came across as very, very important and significant in the therapy. But Dr. Castrillon, I did not hear you say too much about the relationship, although I have geriatric years and I may have missed something.
I didn't say anything.
It's very analytic of you.
Right. This whole question of the relationship is so incredibly complex and like,
Well, if
But let me go about it a different way. As these other fine folk on the panel were speaking, what actually struck me was like something that I was like, why the hell didn't I think about that when I was putting together my most amazing presentation here? Which is a basic concept for Lacanian, something we hold very dear because we want to run away from it in some ways, is jouissance. Right. And one of the big ways in which we translate that, in fact, what's one of the French translations of it, is the enjoyment of making meaning. The enjoyment derived from the making meaning of something, right? And so in other words, beware of that. Be very aware of that. Be aware of it and beware of it, because, Freud, even early on, Freud was able to understand quite clearly, and he had a whole essay on it, analysis, terminable and interminable, right? Where he was referring to how some courses of analysis go on for, the Woody Allen 20+ years version of it, and others end rather soon. The question is like, well, what's the difference between these two? The way Lacan picked up on this is because the joyful part of psychoanalysis or spiritual work is it can be, oftentimes it cannot be as well, but it can be quite joyful. I finally understand why I did this, why I do that. And while that's a necessary and important part of the work, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient by any stretch. From the lineage I come out of, it's not just the making meaning of things and the joy derived of that. That also is a very dangerous place if you stay too long there. You have to go beyond it to truth, not with a big T, but with a very, very small t. The smallest t you can think of. But your truth, which in many ways is quite devoid of meaning in the way that we've been speaking about it this evening. And so, I certainly respect the emphasis there is nowadays on the relationship. And I don't want to fall into this sort of trite and sort of stereotypical, sort of like the Lacanians are always against the relationship, them Lacanians, right? It gets old. And there's some truth to it, but yeah, I want to do something different. I'm already coming off like the dark horse on the panel tonight, so in the vein of doing something a little bit different, I would say that the relationship is important only in what it allows, the speaking of truth. Further than that, I really can't say much else. I mean, unless we speak about specifics, unless somebody's willing to lay down on a couch right here and start speaking to all of us.
Can I add to something?
Yeah.
Can I add to an understanding? If the dark cloud can just come over to my head for a
Oh,
little
yeah.
while, and just I'll balance things out in my mind, that even though I spoke of hope, it's in the face of a tremendous amount of pain that I think the speaking, the unconscious speaking through the language or through the relationship. I know, if I understand Lacanian ideas correctly, that the danger is to fall and to stay into the imaginary,
Right.
and to forget about the real, to forget about how the emergence of the real, the horrors of the traumas, of the intergenerational, the existence of what has happened in the world and in society, and that what people have done to each other in harm and in invisible ways that are impacting us all the time. And I think that from what I understand of American relational words, though it can sound hopeful and secure and attachment and happy, it's actually trying to speak also to the fact that only once, my understanding of it is only when something of that relationship can finally feel somewhat solid, then many of the traumatic elements of the unconscious can finally emerge and speak themselves, I think, in the way that you're talking about it. That it's not, it's almost as if there's little m, big M, and 1.5, like half level. I mean, it's sort of the co-created M is what I would speak to here, because there are things that have existed in generations past that I think must come through that neither person will know will emerge. But there's something that gets stirred up in that real relationship and time together that finally allows these things to come through. And I agree with you that there's nothing about, I think arduous is a great word for this.
Stephen Mitchell has written a book called Hope and Dread in Psychoanalysis, and in which, just as the title might suggest, he is making the case that the psychoanalytic experience and the human experience more broadly conceived, if we're honest and courageous, is an experience of hope and dread. And that they're not experienced stepwise or sequentially, they're experienced together, not unlike what we call a whole object relationship, in which we experience love and hatred for the same object in the same moment. So I think that might do a little bit kind of stitching together, that there is something about psychoanalysis, or any deep therapy, if you like, that mirrors the human experience that's quite dreadful. It's quite dreadful. But that it's not only dreadful. There's the last line of a play called Finian's Rainbow, which is not to be mistaken for the tome Finian's Wake, is this: "Ah, life is dreadful, dreadful indeed, but it's not serious." So there's this movement back and forth, this interface between hope and dread, faith and doubt, the joyful and the painful, that seems to come up over and over again from art. Fine art seems to bring us forward I think courageous psychoanalysis brings us forward, a courageous human life brings it forward.
Just real quick, just on this, because something really struck me as you were talking about. I really appreciate, like, in the write-up and when you were speaking, you spoke about there, at one point you said, there's like, kind of like the suffering that just has to be there. And having read Marcuse years ago, and he speaks about necessary and surplus repression, and I was very clever to take it to the next level and say that there's necessary and surplus. I was being facetious there, wasn't that damn clever. So, but that there's necessary and surplus suffering. And what I find is, what you said it so well with this quote, because it's a certain playfulness with it. We speak difficult things, whether it's in these spiritual traditions, or in psychoanalysis or deep psychotherapy. I hold that as well. But there's a way of saying difficult, which is, it's difficult, yeah, it's difficult. And then there's another way of saying difficult, as in it's difficult and it should have been another way, right? And it's the should have been the other way, or that it should have somehow, for some reason, have been some other way. That's what gets us in trouble. It's that, right? As opposed to, yeah, it's difficult. That just is, yeah. I mean, what was there some guidebook that said, look, it's not supposed to be this tough, all right? If it gets tougher than this, you've been somehow gypped. Something has gone wrong. And it's like, no. This is. It could not have been any other way, right? And I would question, and this is an important question for our work, who says that it was supposed to be another way? Or who told us, personally, I'm talking about each of us individually, in our own subjectivity. Who told us and at which point that it was supposed to be different, right? And that's the surplus suffering that I see all these traditions actually undoing in a very profound way. And that's what really attracts me as well, so.
We have one question out there, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer my interpretation of my summary. And the theme that I am struck by, both by individual speakers and by the panel as a whole, is the idea of the human experience as a dialectic, as two things that seem to be opposing, that exist in the same place at the same time, like faith and the idea of destruction, and like little t and little t and big T, little m and big M, and so that's the theme that I recognize, this idea of dialectic, and even in the relationship, the clinical relationship as well, like two individuals bringing little t creates, like the big T in between.
Many years ago, I asked Tom Ogden, whom I respect a great deal, who were some of the people who influenced him most. And the first person he mentioned was Hegel. Now, for those of you, is Hegel a familiar name to you? He's a philosopher, not an analyst. But Hegel probably formalized the notion of dialectics as fundamental to human experience. Certainly, there were lots of people who talked about dialectics before Hegel. And Hegel may have talked about it even in some misguided ways. But he put on the table in ways that the community could no longer look away from the idea of the fundamentally dialectical nature of human existence. What some have called the inevitable double gesture of all human experience. We don't get it pure. It's not simple. It's always this and that. And the appearance or experience of the purity is usually a delusion because we're repressing something. So, dialectics. Yeah, it's wonderful that your ear picked that up.
You don't have to summarize, you can just ask.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering about, like, your understanding of the term transpersonal, and sometimes I hear it like, talked about in, like, ways of beyond the ego. So I'm wondering if the unconscious itself is considered to be transpersonal as something that is typically understood to be beyond or besides the ego.
We probably ought to refer your question to Nathan, because he was the one who started by talking about the concept of transpersonal.
How did I know you were going to say that?
Nathan can answer it, that's fine.
Well, the way that I was thinking about it then was, to me, the meaning of the word personal and transpersonal is somewhat equivalent to the meaning of the word ego, or what Freud called das Ich, the I. That's what I think we refer to as personal. I guess in the same way, though, as the unconscious is individual in that way, it's very personal. So transpersonal could be beyond ego, it could be, I don't know, personal.
So you perhaps all appreciate the fact that this is a very thorny issue, defining what transpersonal is. And there are places, I presume CIIS is one of them, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology is one of them, who it seems to me should be able to define the term. But no one I know, literally, no one I know has defined it in a way that feels very satisfying. It's extremely difficult to define. It's extremely amorphous. I think that perhaps some of you know a little bit of the history around this guy, Ken Wilber. He's a familiar name to you? Who has, to some degree, I don't want to spread rumors, to some degree dissociated himself from a lot of the transpersonal community. In part because, and you know, certainly he has his foibles, we all do, but in part because of how disenchanted he has been at the way the transpersonal community has gone about attempting to define what transpersonal means, and more importantly, attempting to operationalize what it might mean in the context of psychotherapy. This is extremely, for all the years of trying to define it, in some ways it feels like it's uncharted territory. And that, especially in terms of clinical practice, what it might mean and look like, this is extremely difficult to get at. And often defined with cliches and in language that should embarrass most of us, in my opinion.
I think one thing else I would add to that I think of in response to your question is that I think it goes beyond to the theme of the relational human relationship, the importance of the relationship, that it goes beyond the patient and the therapist in their human attuned co-constructed reality, that there's something greater. And when you asked that question, where I went to was that I think the fact of my patient finding this brutally traumatizing diary entry juxtaposed with the birth of her child on the same day, to me that was a transpersonal moment. I didn't do it, she didn't do it, it wasn't from our human related connection. It was something much larger, certainly, than me or her. And for me, that's an element that is extraordinarily healing, and I think that's an example in an embodied way of something transpersonal as I see it.
I just want to say thank you to all of you for your presentations, and ask if each of you might name one or two books we wanted to learn more about the traditions that you're coming from, what would they be? Where was a good place to start?
There's a new book that came out not too long ago that's contemporary Jungian thought that leaves out some of the classical, and I think that's a loss, but if you want something contemporary, there's something called Jungian Psychoanalysis. And you can get that, it's now available. And it has, it doesn't lay out, it's not a foundational text, but it lays out a lot of contemporary issues that would be fitting with the language that we've all been speaking about. It's pretty easy read.
I think some of the authors, the books and their articles, if they're accessible to you, and if you need help, please let us know, and we can get them for you. The authors that I think I was thinking of today in mind were, keeping in mind, Adrian Harris, Jessica Benjamin, Philip Bromberg.
One sec.
Sorry.
Jessica Benjamin.
Philip Bromberg. Emmanuel Gent, Ghent. Those are great places to start.
Thank you.
And they're beautiful writers too, so.
Most of the authors that Shubha just mentioned publish frequently in a journal called Psychoanalytic Dialectics. And I think that many of them continue to be editors and contributors to that journal. And I find it to be very useful and probably as a journal, a good place to begin to look.
What about Bion? I mean, your description of your reading of that was fascinating.
Well, where to start? So let me recommend a first thing from Bion that's 2 pages. It's 2 pages. It's called Notes on Memory and Desire. It's a cipher that is obviously has 2 pages. It's a very brief statement that contains most of his mature work, Notes on Memory and Desire, in which he says, both in the therapeutic experience and in the experience of being a human being, let go of your memories and let go of your desires. And stop trying to control your anxiety by a kind of pseudo-knowledge. So I'd recommend that as a first reading. There are 3 more things that I'd recommend by him. In this order: Learning from Experience, The Elements of Psychoanalysis, and Attention and Interpretation.
I have to admit, actually, and I'm serious about this, I find your question very difficult. Not because there's not really good works out there, but because I don't know exactly what you're asking for, which is, if you want the book knowledge, there's very good stuff out there, but I don't know if that's what you're asking. If you're asking for something different, I would say, actually, go find an analyst. And I mean that earnestly. And I feel almost embarrassed to say that because it's tough in a venue like this to say something like that. But, because that's the act, right? And there's nothing like that, no book. Having said that, books, you know, when Bob was talking about how he read Beyond the first time and it was like it was comprehensible, but at the same time, there was, like, you knew that he was on to something. Those were your words, right? I would recommend Ecretes, which is one of the few things Lacan wrote, well, a few things, it's a massive tome. And I would recommend Bruce Fink's translation. The old translation is full of inaccuracies. But that's a master work in terms of translation. And then something like I'm using this for an elective I'm teaching this semester on Lacan. But it's Danny Nobis, Nobus. So this is a secondary text, but it's excellent. And it's Jacques Lacan in the Freudian practice of psychoanalysis.
Could I make an addition to what I had said to you, an answer, and thanks to the courage of what you just said. What was just said about analysis. I think if I were to try to look at where my thoughts came from, I could probably also tell you the words of all of the amazing professors I've had, the instructors at my institute, my classmates and cohort at my institute who helped me to think through something, my analyst. All of these influences together are so interwoven, and the community, I feel like I hold the whole experience of analytic relationships and connections with people are in my mind when I try to think. And it's the standing on the shoulders of and hoping that something new will emerge. So I just want to say that, and that I don't think I could ever think this by myself.
Mm-hmm.
And how critical it's been to have the connections.
Mhm.
So.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say something to the panel, and actually maybe to all of you, how much I appreciated what you're doing, and I'm aware that the explicitly spiritual element has not been really talked about explicitly, and yet it's been an incredibly spiritual panel. And it reminds me of Dr. Chowdhury used to say that religion will return to the West not through philosophy, but through psychology. And I think it's exactly what you're doing, bringing a spiritual dimension through psychology. It's precisely through psychology. You're not going off on. I mean, there's another element. I also teach a class on contemporary psychoanalysis and East-West spirituality, and that's talking about how analysts are actually using Zen and Catholicism and other traditions, and they're actually seeing their own tradition in religions. I mean, that is actually happening as well. But I appreciated tonight that you came really as psychologists and talk, although Jung, and as you said, Bob, Bion is a mystic who has a day job. You know, this. Anyway, thank you, because I thought it wasn't exactly what I thought you would do, and I think what you did do was actually very important to show that psychology itself has this depth in it. That's what I got out of it.
You know, the French literary critic André Malraux said that the 21st century will be a spiritual century, or it will not be at all. And so these things that are hopefully emerging in conversation, they're more than recreational.
Yeah.
Thank you for the segue. I'll pounce on it. Thinking about the wisdom of the East coming back to the West for the first time, maybe really with through this profession. Which model of those presented tonight, or combination perhaps, do you think Buddha would prefer? I'll tell you, my own immediate reaction to that is a little offbeat, perhaps. I wonder whether he would pick the Freudian Lacanian because of the most radical critique of the ego. Nothing to do with self-esteem, preoccupations with the self, the imaginary, etc. I just wonder that.
Well, I would most certainly agree with you.
This was spontaneous.
No question, no question. At the same time, you. The thing about it is, it's that Shubha, what you said about everybody who, your fellow travelers along the way. Let's just put it that way, or I'll put it that way. For me, it was psychopathology was my first course in graduate school with a very dearly loved professor of mine, and she said, you know, one time this is actually before I was a Lacanian, and I was going on and on about the ego and all this, and ego this, ego that, bad ego. And she says, why are you critiquing the ego? I said, are we supposed to be doing that? She goes, you can't critique the ego. The ego is what it is. And the reason I bring that up in the context of this is that, sure, there is a very radical critique of the ego, but it's actually more a radical critique of our use of the ego. Like fixating on it and thinking that's what we are, that when we look at ourselves in the mirror that somehow, that's me, that's not you. That doesn't tell you what it is, what you are, but certainly it's not that. And so, I think there's something in terms of, let the ego be what it is. If you live there, you get in trouble a lot. But if you stop living there and start living somewhere else, a place of your own making in many ways, that also gets you in trouble too, but of a different kind. And that's the kind of trouble I want to be in, right? So, yeah.
But I'm wanting to raise a broader question. What might Buddha think of the contemporary psychodynamic and other kinds of therapeutic emphasis and importance on things like self-esteem, liking oneself, all kinds of related, and I address that to anyone.
Well, you make the assumption in that all stripes of contemporary psychoanalysis focus themselves on issues like self-esteem and liking oneself.
Forgive me, but I do see a preponderance, yeah.
Well, it is not necessarily the case. There are other things that are focused on that may eventually, maybe, have as a derivative some increase in self-esteem, but never as a clear focus in and of itself.
Maybe I should make it clear, I'm not speaking about approaches discussed within this room, but looking at the world in general of contemporary therapy, and in America.
There
I
is
see
a
a
meaningful
huge,
difference between contemporary therapy and contemporary psychoanalysis.
Uh,
They have some interface, but they are not the same thing.
I see a lot of it in contemporary psychodynamics and analysis.
Could I try to come at this a little tangentially and hopefully somewhat respond to your question, what you're asking us to think about? My first response instinctively was to say, well, whose Buddha are we talking about? I think this is a tag to connection to what you've all been saying, that if I'm sitting in the room with someone, I want to privilege whatever Buddha means to that person is what matters at that moment, and I'm there to facilitate something about what that means for them and is helping to emerge and maybe let go of what they're trying to have a certain kind of freedom. And when I went through analytic training, the first question I always had was, I would like to know what it is about analysis that would actually, if I got helicoptered into a village in India and I had to sit with somebody, what would I actually say about psychology, or what would I be doing there? What's my point of being there? And how would I help that, so-called village woman who could have been me easily, if life situations had been different? And that's where I would say, in terms of introducing another dialectic that I like to try to think about now, which is you have to have the luxury of having a place in society as a subject before you have the luxury of letting go of your ego. Your place in society has to actually be acknowledged by the people around you. And I think when we were talking earlier about what is it that we all think that we have a right to when we're born, that one of the ideas that Jessica Benjamin has talked about is the idea of this moral third. And what she means by it, my understanding of it, is not the idea of morality in any way. It's about when a baby is born, and roots around and looks for the breast, the baby has an assumption that somebody is there to feed him or her. That there's a certain kind of fairness, there's a certain kind of existence in relationship that we all have a birthright to. And so I wouldn't say that I feel like my work is really about self-esteem per se, but I do think that if people have not had a chance to have some basic birthrights that have been acknowledged, that part one of work together is to establish the fact that they have a right to it and they might find it in the relationship with me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think once something about identity and place in the world is secure, then I think we have the luxury and the capacity, and I think tolerating the anxieties that Bion speaks of, to then feel able to let it go and live in that transpersonal space. Be open to, I think, for example, with Helen's patient and dream, in my mind, Helen's ongoing presence and contact made that moment possible. She needed Helen's presence and all that Helen brought to bear. And then Helen's own, this is my imagination of Helen and her patient, but Helen's own work that she has done to allow the transpersonal into her life made it safer for her patient to also embrace that. So we're together in it all the time.
There's a famous paper called "In Order to Lose Yourself, You Have to Have a Self." I think it's the other way around, actually, that was written, and I think it dovetails what she was saying about that in order to be selfless, there has to be something there to begin with. And when I heard your question, I thought about a time when I was in Tibet, and I basically nearly ran into a monk who was crying, and he didn't speak any English, but I sat with him, and it was this profoundly powerful moment, and I kept thinking, what can I do for this monk in a monastery? He's supposed to be enlightening me, And it was interesting because I think about the different notion of self and culture, and when Shubha said what Buddha and what self, and so in a very Western cultural way, I handed him a Kleenex, and he looked at me like, "Are you crazy, lady?" And he took his sleeve and wiped his nose, and the Kleenex meant nothing to him, and yet for me to just stay with that, to stay present, to stay through it, he then later had a translator tell me that he didn't understand what the paper had to do, what I was doing with that paper, but he really liked that I just sat there and was quiet. But I think here, you know, I can think here where times that giving a Kleenex or not to a patient from a Western construct is a highly meaningful symbolic act, which has a different meaning for our culture or not. And giving them the Kleenex might be the thing that was sustaining to the selfhood of that other person. I mean, I can think of someone that said, my first analyst wouldn't wouldn't do that because that would be gratifying something, and I should have been I have to be responsible for that. So for her, it was very meaningful that I would give a Kleenex, whereas for someone else, maybe not. That makes it interesting, culturally determined.
Seems like we are coming to the end, and I'm just touched, because the panel experience itself, much as you said, Brendan, feels there's something about an unwitting instrument of spiritual sensibility that's arising in me and sitting here. So thank you so much, my friends.